And so we now begin. The relationship between India and the United States has often been described as strategic, indispensable, even historic. But we all know that it has never, ever been simple. Today, amid shifting power equations, the question is not whether India and the United States matter to each other, but how much do they matter to each other? And more importantly, on what terms? To help us examine this with clarity and candor, we are so honored to invite one of the most influential voices on international relations. Please welcome Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Can I request you to join us on stage? I'm also so pleased to invite our chair for this inaugural session, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, parliamentarian, author, and a long-standing advocate of India's role in global affairs.
Well, wonderful to see you here. I was reminding Professor Mearsheimer that there's been at least a sort of 2-decade gap since he and I were last on a stage together, and that was in the US. I'm just delighted to have him here because he is one of the world's foremost realist thinkers. His famous thesis about great powers, the reason why states in their concern for survival tend to arm themselves and get into conflicts they might not necessarily be seeking, but which become inevitable because of their clashing ambitions. This is a thesis that has been hugely influential and has made him a distinctively recognizable advocate of what is known as the realist school of international relations. I'm going to turn to him twice today because he's with us this morning to talk about India-US relations, and this afternoon with Professor Monica Duffy-Toft and Professor Yu Zhentong from Tsinghua University to talk about the larger global picture. But today we'll begin by talking about the question that's on everyone's mind, and I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of the things that are on your and my minds as Indians, I think it's only fair to ask Professor Mearsheimer to lay out for us very briefly his key understanding of international relations and how that relates to the US-India relationship. Professor, you have the floor for the first sort of laying out the context kind of question.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. To talk a little bit about my worldview and how it relates to US-India relations. The key point to remember is that I think that it's largely shaped, and when I say it, I'm talking about the US-India relationship, is by and large shaped by geopolitics. A lot of people tend to think that the fact that India is a democracy and the United States is a democracy is what really explains the relationship between the two countries. I don't believe this at all. I believe it's geopolitics that drives the train. And let me say a few words about that. I was actually born the same year that India was born, 1947, and both India and I have lived through 3 periods: the bipolar Cold War world, the unipolar moment, which ran from roughly 1992 to 2017, and now the multipolar world that we exist in, which I believe started about 2017. In that bipolar world, India and the United States definitely had a rocky relationship. I remember it very well. And the reason that India and the United States had a rocky relationship was largely because of how India related to the Cold War, how India related to the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the fact is that it was remarkably smart for India to be non-aligned, not to get too close to the United States or too close to the Soviet Union. And that, of course, angered the Americans. But if you think about it, India was the only major power during the Cold War that did not align with either the United States or the Soviet Union. Every other major power did. And again, the result of that was a rocky relationship. Then the unipolar moment came, This really happens about 1992, after the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union breaks apart. And because the Soviet Union has disappeared, and the United States and Russia have reasonably good relations throughout the unipolar moment, India is in a sweet spot. It's in a position where it doesn't have to choose between the Soviet Union and the United States. And what happens is that relations between the United States and India begin to improve in significant ways. Then comes multipolarity, roughly around 2017. And when I talk about multipolarity, we're talking about a world where China and Russia are great powers in addition to the United States. We have three great powers in the system. And the peer competitor to the United States is not Russia, it's China. So you would expect from a realist point of view that the United States will balance against China, which of course it has been doing. And given India-China relations and the fact that they have been hostile on occasion, you would expect to have good relations between the United States and India. And for many years, starting in the unipolar moment, but definitely once multipolarity kicks in, U.S.-Indian relations are quite good. And it looks like in this multipolar world, you're going to have much better relations between India and the United States than you did in the bipolar world of the Cold War. But something goes wrong starting last summer and continuing in truth up to the present. And what happens is the Ukraine war. President Trump comes into office, as you all remember, making the argument that he's going to settle the Ukraine war immediately after he takes office. In fact, he was bragging that he would settle the Ukraine war before he took office. That has not happened at all. And he's been desperate to figure out a way to shut the Ukraine war down. And what he's tried to rely on occasion, are economic sanctions. But we've put so many sanctions on the Russians that we're out of sanctions we can put on the Russians. So we began to talk about putting secondary sanctions on the Russians, which meant putting sanctions on India and on China. The United States, of course, could not put meaningful sanctions on China because China has threats that it can bring to bear against the United States. And instead, what happened is the United States focused on punishing India with sanctions. As you know better than I do, this is what happened last year in 2025. And it poisoned relations between India and the United States. And it was not in America's strategic interest to do this, because again, China is a peer competitor to the United States. The United States should be focused laser-like on China, and it should have good relations with India. But again, the fact is the United States has also gotten itself into a total mess in Ukraine, and to get out of that mess, it thought that it could sanction India, and that would help. So what I'm saying to you is the Ukraine war, which continues to go on, has been the principal source of trouble between the United States and India, and it's poisoned relations. I want to make one final point, and that is that one cannot discount President Trump's personality. First of all, President Trump loves tariffs. He is the tariff king. And independent of Ukraine, he's going to put tariffs on countries all over the world, including India. Furthermore, President Trump has a mercurial personality. He changes his view on all sorts of important issues from day to day. India can never be certain what its position vis-a-vis the United States is going to be on tariffs tomorrow or the day after that. That creates a situation where India has an incentive to distance itself from the United States. Or to put it in slightly different words, not to get too close to the United States. You do not want to be in a position where you are dependent on the United States economically, because the United States will use that economic leverage to force you to dance to its tune. So what's going on here at the moment and moving forward is we have this Ukraine war going on that is a source of potential trouble between the United States and India. And furthermore, we have President Trump in the White House for 3 more years, and he loves tariffs, and he loves using American economic leverage against American allies as well as American adversaries. And this is why we have a rocky relationship today, to my surprise, between the United States and India.
Great. Well, thank you for laying that out with your usual clarity. But it begs a few questions. I mean, in the bad old sexist days, the classic question used to be men asking, what do women want? Today, the question around many capitals appears to be people asking, in these Trumpist days, what does President Trump want? I mean, what is his core view of the world? You've talked about the fact that he loves tariffs, you talked about the fact that he loves to be credited for making peace, but at bottom, what does he want out of every relationship? There was a time, for example, when it was fairly clear over the last quarter of a century that successive American administrations seemed to want India to serve to a greater or lesser degree as a counterbalancing or counterweight force against a rising China, with all its aspirations strategically in this region and across the world. Is that even part of President Trump's worldview, or is he only thinking in terms of things like tariffs and short-term transactional issues?
I think it is part of his worldview, but I think that when you elevate to 60,000 feet and you talk about his general view of international politics, you see why he has bad relations with almost every country on the planet. The key thing to remember about President Trump is that he is a unilateralist. And as a unilateralist, he hates multilateral institutions, which is another way of saying he hates international institutions, because you know international institutions involve rules, and rules tie him down. So no unilateralist, and he is a paradigmatic unilateralist, is going to like multilateral institutions. Furthermore, he hates international law, and he doesn't like international law for the same reason he doesn't like international institutions. It puts limits on his power. Again, he is a unilateralist. And with regard to allies, he does not treat allies much differently than he treats America's adversaries. In fact, one could argue he's tougher on our allies than he is on our adversaries. That's not so true with regard to India, South Korea, Japan, the Asian allies of the United States. But if you look at how President Trump treats the European allies, it's really quite remarkable how he slaps them around. But this is exactly what you would expect from a unilateralist. And because the United States is incredibly powerful, he has lots of levers, lots of instruments that he can use to facilitate that that unilateralism. But the argument I would make is that it's not in America's national interest. There is no way that you could operate in the contemporary world without institutions and without international law. As all of you, I'm sure, understand, we meaning the United States, created almost all those institutions. We wrote the international law, and we did it because we thought it was in our interest, and we thought we could write the rules and we could write the laws so they benefited the United States, which they did. All of that is a way of saying that President Trump's approach to wrecking international law and wrecking international institutions is not in the American national interest. We need institutions, we need international law, and we need close allies.
Interesting, but then, one of the key questions laying behind my previous question was the big mystery of how Washington, D.C. views India. For us, It's not that we particularly wanted to play along necessarily with the desire, for example, of many in Washington, that we would be a counterweight to China. But with this new unilateralism that's coming out of Washington, is it even relevant that India could be a significant rising power alternative to China? Is it even necessarily a factor in the calculations of policymakers in Washington that India sees itself increasingly as a rising technological power and potentially, therefore, a worthwhile partner with a fairly major success in developing public digital infrastructure? Is India's role in terms of serving as a sort of strategic swing power in some global competition, is this at all a factor in thinking? Or is it all about specific sort of nuts and bolts individual issues such as the ones you mentioned, tariffs, Ukraine war, whatever? I mean, it's Mr. Trump's freedom to get his own way. How does India figure into the calculations of policymakers? And a sub-question of that is, are policymakers even relevant, or is it only Mr. Trump?
I think that most American policymakers and huge chunks of people in the educated elite in the United States who focus on foreign policy believe that India is a rising great power and will, in the years ahead, be one of the great powers in the world. When I go around and say that we live in a multipolar world, and I say the three great powers in the system are the United States, China, and Russia, I would say 20% of the people that I talk to say you should include India as well. And if I say that I don't think India is a great power today, which I don't, they make the argument that India will be a great power. Furthermore, I think most American policymakers understand that India is an important player in the American effort to contain China. It's a member of the Quad, for example. It has a conflict with China up in the Himalaya Mountains that the United States...
Is there still an American effort to contain China after Trump talking about the G2 when he went to Busan, and after he has delayed the overdue Quad summit in India, which should have taken place last November?
There is absolutely no question that the United States is profoundly committed to containing China. The United States, for all of its history, has been committed to making sure that there is no regional hegemon on the planet except the United States. You all understand that we are a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We completely dominate the Western Hemisphere from a strategic point of view. And in our history, we have gone to enormous lengths to make sure that no other great power dominated either Asia, East Asia, or Europe. That includes Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. And if you read the national security strategy that was issued by the White House in November of 2025, it is unequivocally clear, despite what's said in the media, that the United States is committed to containing China in East Asia. This is in the American national interest. I want to point out that from China's point of view, it is in its national interest to dominate Asia. If I was Xi Jinping's national security advisor, I would tell him that it makes eminently good sense to imitate the United States and dominate East Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. I'd also tell him it's in China's national interest to build the Blue Water Navy that can project power all over the globe to protect Belt and Road and other Chinese interests, just like the United States has a Blue Water Navy. So the Chinese are a peer competitor that are interested in being at least as powerful, if not more powerful, than the United States. And they should be. But we, the United States, have a vested interest in making sure that they don't achieve that goal. And in that endeavor, India is a natural ally of the United States. And that's why I said in my opening remarks, I think it's so unfortunate we now have a rocky relationship.
Right. Well, I think there's been some reluctance on the part of the Indian foreign policy establishment to be seen as playing the US's game, to put it very bluntly. The feeling being that we have our own independent challenges in our relationship with China. Do we need to complicate them by being seen in Beijing as a surrogate of Washington? And I think this is one of the things that has been jeopardized in the rocky 9 or 10 months of the relationship we have endured between Washington and New Delhi, is it has reinforced the hands of those who are skeptical about the merits of India falling into a US policy design vis-a-vis China. So in many ways, Washington has got to be aware of the complications here. I mentioned technology because we saw this very interesting sort of sidestepping dance when America announced a new alliance, Pax Silica, that is obviously intended to be an alternative supply chain to China on high technology items, including rare earths and so on, and then left India out of it at that time. Some months later, about 3 months after the initial announcement, America has sort of moved back a bit and invited India to join it, which wasn't there at the beginning, and India has now joined it 2 days ago. So there's sort of evidence on both sides of the ledger. But I would have always thought that, for example, in something like developing an alternative set of AI and technology models to what's available coming out of China, that the US would have seen India as a national partner, as a natural partner. And yet when Pax Silica was devised, India wasn't there. Is there sort of confused thinking about India in all of these contexts in Washington? Or is there no thinking at all?
Well, let me just start by saying that, as I emphasized in my previous set of comments, I think the United States and China have a particular set of interests of their own which they should pursue. I do believe that countries should focus primarily on what is in their national interest, and that applies to India as well. And I think that India should go to great lengths not to become too dependent on the United States, either economically or militarily. And I believe that most Indians understand that. That was certainly the case during the Cold War, as I emphasized early on. It was in India's national interest to be non-aligned, to not get too close to the United States, even if it angered the United States. The problem that India faces today is that it has powerful incentives to have close relations with the United States, both economically, as you allude to, and both strategically, as I said in my opening comments. And I believe that up until the summer of last year, the Indians believed that they were going to have a close and positive relationship with the United States. But then the tariffs were placed on India. Trump made a number of comments that were deeply antagonistic to the Indian people, and we are where we are today. But what this tells you is that India is in a situation where it has sort of a schizophrenic attitude towards the United States. It understands that from a technological or economic point of view, and from a strategic point of view, it has powerful incentives to have close relations with the United States. But at the same time, given what's happened over the past year, it has powerful incentives not to get too close to the United States. So my advice to India would be to try to walk a fine line, not get too close, but understand that you do have incentives to have good relations with the United States.
Well, that's precisely what we are trying to do, is to dance delicately on that particular tightrope. But the fact is that from a Washington point, I mean, I wrote a column some months ago recalling the Who Lost China debates of the 1950s and asking whether the time would come in the not too distant future when American foreign policy experts might be asking who lost India because of the way in which these developments over the summer took place. I think it's fair to say that President Trump has dialed back a bit from some of the unnecessarily contemptuous rhetoric and the unnecessarily negative language. But some of the substantive lessons learned from that episode will still give pause to people in India, as you can well understand.
If I can make one point on this, the United States does not pay that much attention to India these days because it is bogged down in the Middle East. It is bogged down in Ukraine. And now President Trump has decided to go on a nation-building spree in the Western Hemisphere. He's doing social engineering in Venezuela. He's going to do social engineering in Cuba, maybe Nicaragua. He's talking about making Canada the 51st state. He's talking about conquering Greenland. So he has this whole agenda in the Western Hemisphere. And again, you read the newspaper every morning looking to see whether we've started war against Iran. We're bogged down in the Middle East. We're bogged down in Ukraine. And of course, we have to deal with China at the same time. And President Trump is going to meet with Xi Jinping later this month. Or I guess it's next month. But anyway, the point is we have, as we say in the United States, so many irons in the fire that we don't have that much time to focus on India. And this is actually good news for India, because you don't want the United States focusing too much attention on you, because it just leads to trouble.
That's fair enough. But, again, we're talking about, as you rightly said, the forthcoming March meeting between President Trump and President Xi. That does raise the question of how the U.S. sees China. You mentioned you're convinced still of the fundamental strategic competition between the U.S. and China, in which, for various reasons, including Chinese policy towards India, particularly on our long disputed frontier, we would naturally tend to be wary of Chinese blandishments and more receptive to any American approaches. But if the same President Trump is talking about a G2 and talking about implicitly carving up the world into spheres of influence that might essentially relegate India to the Chinese shadow, if not the Chinese orbit, where would that leave us? I mean, these are questions we have to ask as we look at the US-China relationship that you've alluded to.
We are not going to leave Asia to the Chinese. It's not going to be a Chinese sphere of influence. We don't act according to spheres of influence. We have a basic view that has dominated American foreign policy since the get-go, which says that we are a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, and we will not tolerate any other great power dominating either East Asia, Europe, or the Persian Gulf. The idea that we're going to allow China to create a sphere of influence in East Asia is is just not realistic. We're not going to allow that to happen.
Well, that's a welcome assurance, Professor. But then let me push back in a slightly different direction. You talked much earlier about multilateralism and multipolarity. One of the ways in which India could have served as a balancing figure, as a balancing power, would have been by a strengthened role in multilateral global institutions in an increasingly multipolar world, where India's influence in a number of forums might have counterbalanced China's. Now what you're seeing is, with Trump's and the US's retreat from and withdrawal from a lot of these multilateral institutions, the very institutions in which India is seeking greater representation and influence have become less relevant. So how exactly does the US serve its own cause by abandoning India on the multilateral ship, as it were?
Well, the United States does not even serve its own cause by greatly reducing, if not abandoning, these international institutions. I think there's no question about that.
World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, the UN, and of course, in your hemisphere, you've got the uncertainties around the European Union and NATO as well, don't you?
I agree 100%. There's no question about that. But I would just say, as a good realist, India's principal concern is more strategic than it has to do with international institutions. And the fact is that the Indian-China competition is only going to grow more intense with the passage of time. There's already a significant conflict up in the Himalaya Mountains along the line of control between the Indians and the Chinese. Both sides are building up their military forces there. China and Pakistan are going to be closer and closer allies with the passage of time.
Oh, they already are, extremely close.
Yes,
we've just had a taste of it in our little 4-day conflict last year.
I fully understand that, but I would argue it's going to get even closer. Furthermore, as I said to you, you want to understand the Chinese are building a blue water navy, and that blue water navy is going to be principally designed in the beginning to project power to the Persian Gulf. And that means it's going to come through the Indian Ocean. So India is going to face a powerful Chinese navy in addition to the problem of Pakistan, in addition to the problem on the Himalaya Mountains. And again, this is what will drive the United States and India to have good relations moving forward.
Well, you're starting me on one of my hobby horses. I point out that India actually has a longer coastline into the Indian Ocean than China does, and could also develop a blue water navy if it was willing to commit the resources and the strategic heft to doing so. And it's better positioned bang in the middle of the ocean than China, which is on one side of it. So in many, many ways, a naval competition is a natural area for India to assert itself, but that's a whole different topic, I guess. And I don't think the US is averse to that, but nor has been particularly helpful in promoting such ambitions.
I agree with that, but let me just make one quick set of points. I believe that the two building blocks of military power are population size and wealth. And I think the reason that China is a peer competitor of the United States today, and the United States views China as its principal threat or its principal adversary, is because China has a huge population and it has a great deal of wealth. And it's especially sophisticated, it's especially good at developing sophisticated technologies. Now, if you look at India today and you look at India moving forward and you think about those two building blocks, in terms of population, India now has slightly more people than China does. And if you project out 50 years, India will have a significantly larger population than China. So in terms of that building block, India is in excellent shape. The problem is wealth. And in terms of wealth generation, the big question on the table is, will the Indian economy grow by leaps and bounds over the next 50 years, the way the Chinese economy grew by leaps and bounds from, let's say, 1990 up to the present?
But there is a related question. The US was a hugely influential factor in facilitating China's growth and wealth. Will it play a similar role with India? There were massive American investments in the Chinese economy, massive American transfers of technology, willing and otherwise, and China's growth owed a tremendous degree to the impetus provided by American business involvement.
I would argue that the United States, for the foreseeable future, has an incentive to help the Indian economy grow for the purpose of balancing against China. And let me just tell you two quick stories on that front. First of all, if you go back to the Cold War, as almost all of you know, from roughly 1945 until the late 1960s, early 1970s, China and the Soviet Union were allies. Then starting in 1972, the United States flipped China, and China became an ally of the United States against the Soviet Union during the last part of the Cold War. And during that part of the Cold War, we had a powerful incentive in helping the Chinese economy grow for purposes of containing the Soviet Union. Two other examples, Germany and Japan. During the Cold War, Germany and Japan flourished economically. They were able to generate great amounts of wealth. The United States was willing to help the German and Japanese economy recover from World War II and to have those two economies grow by leaps and bounds, because Germany in Europe and Japan in East Asia were our two principal partners for the purpose of containing the Soviet Union. So I would argue, if you think about India and China, we, the Americans, have a deep-seated interest in helping the Indians get richer, right, so that India becomes more powerful, so that it can help us contain China. From your point of view, you have a profound interest in making sure that your economy grows at a rapid pace for the next 50 years, because given your population size, if you become a really wealthy country, you may become the most powerful state on the planet.
Well, this is a wonderful note on which to end. Our time is up. The half an hour went very quickly. But I do want to say, first of all, that I hope that this last message that the US has a vested interest in India's growth will also be heard in Washington. I'd be grateful if you start saying this in the US policy space in which people do listen to you. And the second thing that I think one question the organizers wanted me to end with is, how do you, and by extension, how does the US see our Prime Minister and the government of India today?
I think there's no question that the American government, the Trump administration, looks very favorably on the Modi administration. I think these two governments in Washington are seen as birds of a feather. They're both basically right-wing governments, and I use that phrase in a benign way. And I think that President Trump personally likes Prime Minister Modi, and although I think Prime Minister Modi has mixed emotions about President Trump today, by and large, he views him in terms of politics and in terms of strategy as a natural ally.
Good to hear that. Well, I look forward to having you back in the afternoon when we are joined by a Chinese scholar and an American scholar for further discussions on the broader world disorder that we should be discussing. But meanwhile, on India-US relations, thank you for that wonderful perspective. Professor John Mearsheimer, do give him a hand, ladies and gentlemen.
What a wonderfully layered conversation this has been, and thank you for leading it so in such an articulate fashion as you always do, Dr. Tharoor. We'd like you both to kindly remain on stage as I request Mr. Shashi Sinha, Strategic Advisor, Omnicon Group, to kindly join us on stage, as well as Dhruva Mukherjee, Director, ABP Network, to present our guest with the memento from the ABP Network. A beautiful conversation, and just on a lighter note, since Dr. Tharoor mentioned it, you know, the world has not figured out what women want, and perhaps that mystery will stay alive when it comes to President Trump and what he wants as well. And of course, we'll hear more from Professor Mearsheimer later in the afternoon. A huge round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen, for a brilliant inaugural session.